Good morning. I'm very honored to be able to introduce the final speaker of the conference today, Professor Williamson Murray. He's Professor Emeritus of History from The Ohio State University and is currently a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Defense Analyses in Alexandria, Virginia, and a member of the National Strategic Studies Group. A graduate of Yale University, he served in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War with the 314th Tactical Airlift Wing, which flew C-130s. A prodigious military historian. He's the author or editor of numerous books and really put, I don't know if Ohio State was Rome or Byzantium, but it certainly was one to the other at UNC Chapel Hill, and produced many military historians, like Colonel Herbert, among others, throughout the years. Did a real service, I think, to the Academy as in academics by kind of keeping the flame lit on this subject matter as a intellectually rigorous form of academic research. Professor Murray's taught at basically all the military academies or war colleges. He taught at USAMA, at West Point, but also all the major war colleges. You can read his numerous publications. He's co-editing a volume that's coming out. It's called Making the Peace, about rulers and war. And also, Bertie tells me that he's working on a book now about the American Civil War. Thank you, Professor Murray.
Let me begin by making two general comments. The first is that I provided Alan Luxembourg and FPRI with a military history bibliography, which they are going to make available to you. It is in the public domain. I did it for my graduate students and then reworked it for the Institute for Defense Analyses. And so feel free to make as many copies of it as you want. It only has approximately 1,200 entries on it. Although I was inveigled by my boss at IDA to choose my top 25 in military history and write a short description of why I thought it was one of the 25 top books in military history that military professional or anybody else should read. And it's totally idiosyncratic, but it may be of some use to you. The second thing I'd like to do here is to thank the teachers who are here. I have spent the last 3 semesters teaching at the Naval Academy as visiting professor. And very clearly, in terms of my plebe classes there, I have taught naval history to plebes. They have divided into 3 very distinct groups. One group, about 1/3, very clearly taught by people like yourselves who give a damn about history and who convey that interest to their students, obviously reinforced by their parents and others. 1/3 of them actually know a little bit, a smattering of history, and if they work hard, can sort of screw themselves up to maybe a B- or a B. And then the other third. Now you have to remember, these are kids with 1,200, 1,300 SATs. The other third can't find the Hudson River, can't tell you when the Civil War occurred, can't name anybody except George Washington in terms of the leading American figures of the Revolutionary War. And we have a problem which you're not part of. In fact, you're maybe repairing some of the damage done by the execrable, terrible teachers who are out there and school systems who don't give a damn about history. And that brings me to sort of make a couple points before I launch into my paper. And that is very shortly, what is the importance of history? Well, folks, the last 4 years of miserable performance by our political and military leaders in Iraq, where we have managed to repeat every single mistake we made in Panama and Vietnam. And that isn't even modern history. That's history we've lived. And it is an extraordinary comment, if you will, on the arrogance and ahistoricism of the American people. And we are paying a terrible price for that in terms of the lives of our young people who have been over there. To sum it up, and perhaps lighten the mood very slightly, I think what best sums up the attitude of the human race towards the plague of war is a wonderful skit that Dudley Moore and Peter Cook put on in the early 1970s called The Frog and the Peach. And in this skit, Peter Cook was the owner of a really terrible restaurant located in the Yorkshire bogs called The Frog and the Peach, which the two main specialties were frog à la pêche, which was a large frog brought to your table with a peach in its mouth and boiling Cointreau poured over it. And the second specialty was pêche à la frog, which was a giant peach brought to your table, boiling Cointreau poured over it, and when you cut it open, tadpoles swam out. Well, for 15 minutes it goes on with the insanity that those two could create. But at the end of it, Dudley Moore looks at Peter Cook and says, "Have you learned from your mistakes?" And this sums up human history. Peter Cook says, "Yes, I have gone over my mistakes in great detail, studied them again and again, and feel fully confident I can repeat every one of them." Had a visitor from outer space arrived in the Earth in 1450 and made a careful examination of the major power centers across the globe, he would certainly not have picked Western Europe and its inhabitants as the most likely group to break out from their isolation and become dominant among the various world civilizations and cultures. In 1453, Constantinople was to fall to the Turk, and it appeared likely that soon after the Ottomans had finished with the Balkans, they would make mincemeat of what was left of Christendom. The Ottoman Empire, China, India, and perhaps even the Mongols all appeared far more promising candidates for world hegemony. The Western Europeans at best represented a group of fractious, quarrelsome, and small states, almost always at war with each other. The only thing they possessed in common was religion. Within slightly more than half a century, that too would fracture into a Protestant Northern Europe and a Catholic Southern Europe, adding that much more ferociousness to the constant series of wars that beset the small peninsula at the end of the Euro-Asian continent. In the largest sense, it was that divisive community of states that provided Western Europe with the competition and combativeness to advance across a whole spectrum of pursuits, from science and technology to political theories. But one of the most important of the arenas of competition was that of war. And it is that subject of war in the West that we shall examine today. War is a dark, grim endeavor for anybody who has either participated in it or studied it. Yet it has been the one constant in the history of human affairs. Human beings, one could almost say, have been hardwired to conduct war. Yet today we live in a first world that has a tendency to believe that peace, not war, is the natural order of things. In fact, historically speaking, it is not even in our world today. As the great military historian Sir Michael Howard has suggested in his wonderful book, The Invention of Peace, quote, "Peace is not an order natural to man. It is artificial, intricate, and highly volatile. All kinds of preconditions are necessary, not the least a degree of cultural homogeneity, best expressed through a common language, to make possible the political cohesion that must underlie a freely accepted framework of law and at least a minimum level of education through which that culture can be transmitted. Further, as states develop, they require a highly qualified elite capable not only of operating their complex legal, commercial, and administrative systems, but of exercising considerable moral authority over the rest of society." In historical terms, there have been few periods which one can characterize as having the mark of such characteristics. The Pax Romana that lasted from 30 BC through 235 AD may represent such a period, But it is well to remember the peace of the Mediterranean world rested entirely on the tough Roman legionnaires who guarded the empire's frontiers from Hadrian's Wall in northern England through the Parthian frontier and the fringes of the Mesopotamian valley. Approximately, and this is well worth remembering, 30 legions, 150,000 legionnaires supported by 150,000 auxiliaries were sufficient to defend the entire Mediterranean basin against large numbers of barbarians who wanted to visit and wreck the place. For Rome's external enemies, the 10-plus years of ravaging Germany served to disabuse the German tribes of the notion that the Roman defeat at Teutoburg-Wald was typical. For those inside the empire who rebelled against Roman rule, Masada, the destruction of the temple, and the Diaspora were more than sufficient to warn against internal rebellion. Rome's military successes did not depend on superior technology. What it depended upon was what our military organizations depend on: discipline and training. In his examination of the reasons contributing to the defeat of the Jewish rebellion, the great Roman Jewish historian Flavius Josephus underlined the Romans' greatest advantage was their training regime. I have a long quote here, but it can just be at the end, sums it up. He says, "For their military exercises by no means fall short of the tension of real warfare, but every soldier is every day exercised, and that with real diligence as they were in time of war, which is why they bear the fatigue of battle so easily. Nor would an individual be mistaken who would call their exercises unbloody battles and their battles bloody exercises." Victor Davis Hanson, who I greatly admire, has argued on a number of occasions that the model of Western militaries has been the Greek phalanx. I would disagree very strongly there. It is, in fact, the Romans to whom the Western Europeans would turn in search of a model for military forces and military discipline. The period followed the Roman Empire suggests how tenuous peace has been through most periods of history. In the 3rd and 4th century, the Pax Romana collapsed, never to be restored. A series of ferocious barbarian invasions followed Rome's collapse over a period which lasted for over 6 centuries, and which culminated in the ferocious Viking raids of the 10th and 11th centuries. Moreover, from the 7th century on, the Europeans confronted constant pressure from Saracen infidels on the frontiers of the Balkans, Sicily, and particularly Spain. Yet wars against external invaders only represented the tip of the iceberg, as the Europeans appeared even more willing to slaughter each other. From its earliest days, the medieval world presented a landscape of constant, unremitting conflict. Internecine war between and among kings and great nobles, among the great nobles themselves, and among what can best be described as marauding knights and mercenaries fell on the backs of the peasants in emerging towns. Admittedly, all was not war, at least not among the monarchs. The 100 Years' War between France and England did see truces between the major contestants. After all, there were only 3 major battles in the 100 Years' War: Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. But the problem for the peasants and villagers of France was the fact that even during periods of truce among the great and mighty, there existed nothing that to our eyes would resemble peace. Bands of marauders, unemployed soldiers and mercenaries, not to mention quarreling nobles, kept the countryside in a constant state of turmoil, which at times became too much for the Jacques, as the French chronicler, but not very good historian, Froissart, so contemptuously referred to the French peasants. But only under the most desperate of circumstances, such as after the catastrophic defeat of the French army at Poitiers, were the Jacques willing to rise in murderous rebellion against their lords and masters, who had not only failed to stop the foreign invaders, but had not even been able to keep the peace at home among themselves. Nevertheless, there were, interestingly enough, in terms of developments, technological developments which were crucial for the future history of Europe. And there's some considerable irony in this, or at least in one of these developments. Obviously, the development of steel plate and better steels was driven by military needs. But gunpowder, which Chinese had appeared to have invented, although the Europeans may have played a role in its invention as well, was of really little military use until it was combined with the technology of pouring bronze for the great cathedral bells of Europe. And once that capability had been developed to provide the great cathedrals across the landscape with bells to call the faithful to church service, that technology proved fully capable of turning out very useful cannons, which then the kings, because they were so expensive, were able to use in the late Middle Ages to break the power of the great nobility. Nevertheless, if war acquired more centralization and capabilities at the end of the Middle Ages, armies possessed few of the qualities that we would recognize in military organizations today. They possessed little discipline, while logistical support was minimal. Without the logistical or financial basis on which disciplined formations must depend, the first move in most wars invariably aimed at placing one's army, really armed mobs, on the territory of the enemy, where its resemblance to a plague of locusts was clear to all. The hope of those employing armies was that they could damage the enemy's territory more than one's own. Great campaigns more often than not degenerated into massive plundering expeditions, which in fact appears to have been the purpose of both the Crécy and Poitiers campaigns. In the 17th century, a fundamental change in the European states took place, and in war. A number of historians, including myself, have suggested that this was the first of a series of military and social revolutions, which we might term almost as great earthquakes, which changed the fundamental nature of not only society but war. And then surrounding those, if you will, great earthquakes were pre-shocks and aftershocks, where changes within military organizations occurred, and we have now called those revolutions in military affairs. The first great military social revolution, which depended on a whole series of revolutions in military affairs, was the emergence of the modern state. Military social revolution then was much more than simply a military change, but economic, political, and social structure of military organizations and their relationship to the state fundamentally changed. In effect, armies were now able to support the state in a symbiotic relationship. The result, in terms of the creation of military organizations, were armies and navies which we today would recognize in form, culture, and discipline as similar to 21st century military organization. The most important step came with the deliberate reinvention of the Roman legion, now equipped with gunpowder weapons. At the end of the 16th century, Maurice of Orange had the Roman marching commands translated into Dutch so that he could drill his soldiers according to Roman tactical patterns. And oh, by the way, for those of you who've been in the military, the commands we use today, forward march, attention, right face, are in fact the same commands Roman legionnaires used over 2,000 years ago. It took, interestingly enough, the Dutch about 8 months to figure out how to use them, and if anybody wants to follow that rabbit hole, I'll be glad to during the Q&A. These processes of innovation and adaptation were important because generals could now thin out their battle lines with better disciplined and drilled formations of the new pattern armies. Thus, armies could maximize the potential of gunpowder weapons. Gustavus Adolphus, in particular, drew out this innovation to its full potential and won a series of devastating victories over the armies of the Catholic Habsburgs in Germany. The series of revolutions in military affairs stabilized at the end of the 17th century. The last technological innovations came with the invention of the ring bayonet.
The vast changes of the 17th century allowed the European powers to contest with each other for control of the globe, from the forests of North America to India to the Spice Islands of the Indies. Yet, ironically, between 1700 and 1815, there were few changes in the weapons with which the Europeans fought. Over a century later, Wellington's troops in the peninsula and at Waterloo were still using an equivalent to the Brown Bess musket, a weapon similar to what Marlborough's troops had used against the French at Blenheim. What is crucial in terms of world history was that naval developments and technology followed those on land. The first step was the development of ocean-going vessels, initially to pursue the fishing grounds well out into the Atlantic beyond the North Sea, but then turned to exploration of the further seas with the hope of discovering trade routes to China and the Indies. That, in turn, led to the discovery of the American Indian civilizations, which combination of disease and superior military power allowed the Europeans to dispose of in short order. And again, in terms of the wonderful sort of political correctness that lies out there in the landscape of American ignorance, is the idea that somehow the American Indians were deeply in love with their order and very peaceful group. I mean, anybody who knows anything about the Aztecs in terms of a bad group who fully deserved to be exterminated. And in fact, the reason the Spanish won was because the rest of the locals in the area were delighted to exterminate the Aztecs. The competition for power and control over the world's oceans among the major European sea powers, Spain, the Netherlands, France, and Britain, further pushed the technological development of warships and merchant vessels alike, which further expanded the reach of the first oceanic empires in world history. The denouement of this struggle came in 1759 during the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, the so-called Annus Mirabilis, when British sea and land forces thrashed the French in India, North America, and the Caribbean. The result has been the fact that today English is the language of choice across the globe, a fact which the French have never forgiven the British, or us for that matter. Might mention that sort of one of those throwaway items that interests students, but also has an enormous political and strategic impact for the 21st century, is that the country with the largest number of fluent English speakers is not the United States, it is India. The innovations and adaptations that took place occurred within the framework of military forces or in how states paid for the wars they fought. In the latter case, the British gained an enormous advantage over the French when they radically altered how they paid for their wars at the end of the 17th century, in effect creating the first modern system of finance. The failure of the French monarchy to create a similar system eventually led to its financial collapse and the Revolution of 1789. The first truly revolutionary change in the European way of war, if you will, again, military social revolution, again occurs at the end of the 18th century. The first, or one of these, because they both occur concurrently, although they really don't influence each other except indirectly, the first of these was, of course, the French Revolution, or the most obvious. An event, in terms of its military social implications, that completely upset the social and political framework within which the European states had conducted their wars since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. When the revolutionaries in Paris, confronting military defeat in the field with Prussian and Austrian armies invading northern France, decreed the levée en masse, they were executing the most fundamental adaptation, namely in the very nature of the relationship between the individual and the state in wartime. The French Revolution's Assembly explicitly decreed that everyone was now at the service of the nation. And let me just quote you just a short, wonderful section from that. It said, "From this moment until our enemies have been driven from the territory of the Republic, the entire French nation is permanently called to the colors. The young men will go into battle. Married men will forge weapons and transport supplies. Women will make tents and uniforms and serve in the hospitals. Children will make old cloth into bandages. and old men will have themselves carried to the public squares to rouse the courage of the warriors and preach hatred of the kings and the unity of the republic. Implications of this best described by Clausewitz. He said, suddenly war again became the business of the people, a people of 30 millions, all of whom considered themselves to be citizens. The people became a participant in war instead of governments and armies as heretofore. The full weight of the nation was thrown on the balance. The resources and efforts now available for use surpassed all conventional limits. Nothing now impeded the vigor with which war could be waged, and consequently the opponents of France faced the utmost peril. And furthermore, he adds, it was not until Europe's statesmen had at last perceived the nature of the forces that had emerged in France that they could meet the French on an even footing, at least when Napoleon was not present. That adaptation at the strategic and political levels, however, took nearly 20 years, as well as innumerable humiliations and military feats at the hands of the armies of the French Revolution and Napoleon, before the opponents of France finally adapted to the political and social realities of a life and death struggle. Nevertheless, while this great social and military revolution was burning itself across Europe in terms of the great wars between 1792 and 1815, and even more important, social and military revolution was occurring in Great Britain. One that had relatively little impact on the battlefield. We all know it as the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed the way the British economy worked in basic ways. By revolutioning the means of production, it altered the basis on which human economic activity had rested since the dawn of time, namely human and animal muscle power. In effect, the economic and financial gains that this revolution in economic affairs and technology provided the British with a financial support to support both a great navy and a land army, and the financial contributions to the great coalitions that fought Napoleon and eventually brought his empire to destruction. When those wars were over in 1815, very clearly Europe settled back in a deep desire to avoid war at almost any cost for the next 40 to 50 years, and a belief that the best way to do this was to shove nationalism and liberalism back into the bottle where it had existed before 1792. But the Industrial Revolution was fundamentally changing things in ways that were going to affect now, when wars occurred, the battlefield. The first war this occurred was the Crimean War. But in fact, that was really only a technological replay of, if you will, 18th century cabinet wars. The fourth great military social revolution began with the American Civil War. And what it saw was the combination of the Industrial Revolution with the French Revolution. It combined the two into the ability of the North to project military forces logistically and financially, and also, as I think most of us know, with a direct impact on the battlefield. The American Civil War was, in that respect, the first modern war. Not only did the Industrial Revolution allow the North to project military forces in there and support them over continental distances, but it also changed the technology of the battlefield. Unfortunately, for two fundamental reasons, the European powers failed to heed the warning of the North American battlefield. The first was the casual dismissal by all too many European generals of what was happening in North America. As the great Graf von Moltke, chief of the German General Staff, said, the American Civil War had no significance for the Germans because it was just simply a battle between ill-trained militias. What, of course, he missed was that in Sherman's 1864-1865 campaigns, the logistical support of Union armies in the march to Atlanta, the defeat of Southern armies around Atlanta, and then the logistical support that Union armies and Sherman got from the march from Savannah north to North Carolina. In every respect, he was dead wrong. Second reason for the Europeans missing the fact that the Industrial Revolution, the French revolutions were coming together, lay in the fact that there were a series of short, sharp conflicts in the 1860s and early 1870s. The first two really did not take in any sense that combination of nationalism of the French Revolution and mobilization of the nation, but the third did. Unfortunately for European history, the French, at the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, managed to lose their entire army in the first 2 months of the war. A piece of military incompetence that perhaps only the Arab armies in 1967 managed to equal. With the catastrophic sort of start to the war, the fact that both the French and the Germans unleashed nationalism prevented the French from actually being able to extend the war into 1871, 1872, and 1873, which if they had had, if you will, a military force on which to build volunteer mobilized armies, they might well have been able to do. The result was that for Europeans, the combination of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution came together in the First World War. The most terrible and at the same time influential conflict in human history. Politically, it would not end until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. Over the period from 1871 to 1914, after the Franco-Prussian War, Europe, the United States, British dominions underwent, if you will, an extraordinary technological and scientific explosion that had never occurred before in human history. The Industrial Revolution had come into its own. It provided a vast new set of technologies for armies and navies and advances with immense implications for the battlefield. It also, I think, is worth noting that a substantial portion of these technological changes, which came faster and faster, came out of the civilian world before 1914. Since European armies used technological advances in weaponry almost exclusively against colonial opponents who possessed little technology, it was not readily apparent what the full impact of these weapons might be. I might note that some of these advances were obvious to future opponents, such as the machine gun. Others, such as barbed wire, were not. Certainly many of the military observers were able to point out the implications to general staffs, which then proceeded to enthusiastically ignore the warnings, particularly in the case of the Russo-Japanese War. Even more disastrous for the fate of a whole generation of young European men and American men, as we can see in this museum, was the fact that the Industrial Revolution had created societies of immense depth and resiliency, capable quite literally, in John F. Kennedy's words, of paying any price, bearing any burden. That was now not, of course, how European economists or politicians saw matters before the war, but European society was far stronger and more resilient than at any time in human history. The result of the combination of the French and Industrial Revolutions was the opposing sides were able to throw together immense armies, well equipped with the most modern technologies, and then keep them well supplied in the field with immense quantities of ammunition and weapons, not to mention food and clothing. In effect, European societies were able to keep doing this on a seemingly endless basis, no matter how much the soldiers and their loved ones back home might have suffered. In fact, the terrible casualties suffered month after month only made the opposing societies more willing to see the war through to its bloody end, to justify the losses they'd suffered thus far in the conflict. Generally, historians have seen The First World War is a conflict involving incredible stupidity by the generals and their staff. And that was certainly there. As the wonderful poem by Siegfried Sassoon suggests, if I were fierce and bald and short of breath, I'd live with scarlet majors at the base and speed glum heroes up the line to death. And when the war's done and you stone dead, I'd toddle safely home and die in bed. Yet such criticisms miss an essential point. The tactical problems raised for the battlefield in this terrible conflict were extraordinarily complex and multifaceted. There was no simple, easy silver bullet such as the tank as a solution. Moreover, the First World War battlefield was one where both sides were adapting and changing at a rapid rate throughout the conflict. And by introducing new technologies and tactics, they invariably added to their own problems as well as those of their opponents. In fact, World War I, which historians have tended to see as a static, hopeless contest, largely because there was so little movement of the front lines, at least on the Western Front, actually saw huge changes on the battlefield. How big were those changes? I think it's best to use an analogy I've used with undergraduates, that if you could magically go back in time and take a brigade commander off the 1918 battlefield and transmit him to the Gulf War or even the War of 2003, once you'd explained the weapons systems, he would be able to understand what you were trying to do. If you took a regimental commander off the battlefield of 1914 and put him on the 1918 battlefield, he would understand nothing. That's how much warfare had changed. And oh, by the way, in terms of the great German advances of 1918, the Germans managed to kill twice as many of their own soldiers in doing those advances as the British and French had suffered at places like the Somme and Verdun. Why was World War I such an influential conflict? I would suggest to you that it destroyed the Enlightenment's belief in progress. Moreover, that destruction in belief led many Europeans and others to search for new paths. And two of the paths chosen by those who rejected the past were communism and fascism, Nazism. Like the liberal Weltanschauung of the Anglo-American world, which largely believed that war in the modern world was impossible in the 1920s and 30s, the two great ideological monstrosities placed war at the very heart of their belief systems. Communism with class war, Nazism with racial war. The First World War fundamentally also altered the balance between civilian technologies and those developed by military forces. From 1914 through to the end of the Cold War, military technology now drove civil technology. In the period during the interwar years, military organizations pushed the development of technologies like the airplane and radio with spin-offs like radar, all of which had immense significance for civilians. Yet the Second World War largely reflected the developments that had occurred in the last conflict. Admittedly, the pace of weapons technology rapidly increased, but for the most part, the Second Great War was simply an expansion of capabilities of the tactical framework of the First World War in 1918. What was crucial was the sustained efforts to utilize those capabilities in a more coherent and effective fashion. In other words, to marry technological and tactical developments to operational concepts. Here, the study of what had actually happened in World War I proved crucial in the innovations and developments of what can best be described as revolutions in military affairs. Among these developments were modern combined arms warfare, carrier warfare, amphibious warfare, modern logistics, strategic defense, and air defense systems. There's a tendency among historians to quote each other's works without seriously examining the evidence or thinking through in a serious fashion what the evidence actually suggests. One of the great myths of the historical profession is that military organizations study the last war, and that's why they do well in the next. That's fundamentally wrong. They don't study the last war. They study what they'd like to think happened in the last war, what makes them look good as they rub their tummies in great delight. In fact, The real explanation of why the Germans did so well in 1939, 1940, and 41 on the tactical battlefield was that they actually rigorously and honestly studied what had happened in 1918. Military organizations like the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Corps had no interest in studying the last war, which is why they came up with theories of strategic bombing to the exclusion of all other aspects of air power. In fact, one of the driving forces in their theories was a belief that air power was the silver bullet which would remove attrition from war. How well did it remove attrition from war? Let me suggest to you that a young American in 1942, with a choice between joining the 8th Air Force or the Marines in the Pacific and doing Taro and Okinawa, had a better chance of surviving the war by joining the Marines. In fact, 8th Air Force in the summer of 1943 and fall of 1943 suffered 30% crew losses every month. The reason there was a 25 mission and you can go home level was because, in fact, virtually none of the crews reached 25 missions. In fact, that wonderful movie whose title has immediately flown out of my mind, the Capra film. I keep wanting to say the Enola Gay, but that's the wrong example. Whatever it is, the reason it was so celebrated in June of 1943 was, in fact, it was the first American crew and airplane that had flown 25 missions, and we'd been bombing over the European continent since the summer of 1942. The lesson of innovation in the interwar period was that those who rigorously studied the last war and realistically tested their assumptions proved to be those best prepared to fight and adapt to the realities of combat. Some historians have described World War I as the chemist's war. If that is so, then World War II was a physicist's war. And the explosion of the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki underlines that fact. Let me say, in terms of that act, that it was crucial to preventing what would have been a holocaust in the Pacific for both the Japanese and the Americans. It ended the most bloody and destructive combat in human history. And I also suggest to you that the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki may well have the unintended impact in the Cold War, particularly in the early 1950s, when the secondary effects of radiation began to become clear in studying the populations of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, in preventing the United States and the Soviet Union from employing nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War. The implications of what nuclear war really meant undoubtedly persuaded the statesmen on both sides of the Iron Curtain to move more carefully. Thus, despite the fact there were two deeply opposed ideological opponents, the result was a peaceful end to a contest rather than the catastrophe of 1945. What is worthy of note is that while the pattern of military technology driving was military technology influencing the civil world, the pattern continued from the First World War through to the end of the Cold War. But I think one of the really significant things today in terms of military organizations is that pattern has now shifted back to the civilian technological developments, very clearly have a huge impact on how militaries think and prepare for war. Nevertheless, even though there was no great power conflict during the Cold War, all too many Americans of my generation discovered that war had not yet disappeared from the human condition, nor, I would like to suggest to you, has it disappeared from the world. The wars of decolonization rippled across the collapsing great empires of Europe, the last of which, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, helped to bring the evil empire to its dismal end. But arising out of the end of the Cold War has been new challenges raised by a substantial portion of the Islamic world, a portion of the Islamic world that has found itself deeply torn between the concepts and religious beliefs of the Middle Ages and those of modernity. All too many in the West see the difficulties in the Middle East entirely emerging from the creation of Israel. But we should not forget that there never would have been any such thing as a Palestinian entity without the Jewish state. Had the Jewish settlers lost the 1947-48 War of Independence, the conquering Arab armies would simply have divided Palestine among themselves after slaughtering the Jews. What we should take away from the current state of the world is a sense that the first world, hopefully including China, has learned the warnings of the 20th century, that war among its members will prove catastrophic for all. However, there is a great gap between that realization, which largely rejects the notion of human conflict, and the rest of the world, where war and conflict remain fundamental aspects of the human condition. As I would suggest to you, Colin Gray's title of his most recent book unfortunately presages what the 21st century will look like. His title is Another Bloody Century. Michael Howard has perhaps said it best in his discussion of the realities involved in the maintenance of peace. He has said, "We have thus not yet escaped from the world of power politics and raison d'etre, nor does the increasing multiplicity of national actors in itself guarantee a more peaceful and better ordered world. Kant was right when he said that a state of peace had to be established. What perhaps even he did not discern was that this is a task which has to be tackled afresh every day of our lives, and that no formula, no organization, and no political or social revolution can ever free mankind from this inexorable duty and difficulty." What that requires is an understanding of war and history and human nature. By pretending that war will go away if we do not study it or attempt to understand it, as is the case with most of America's institutions of higher learning, that kind of attitude will only ensure that we will have to fight wars that much more often, and usually at far higher cost in terms of what we so deeply value, the lives of our young men and women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Murray, for that sobering account. We have a few minutes for questions, and you can just tilt your 10 card upwards if you have a question. Mark Yanaway.
You mentioned Victor Davis Hanson, who's come up before in this. And I wanted to get your opinion on sort of volunteer and professional armies and their relationship to civil society. One of the propositions is that in the transition from a Bronze Age army to an Iron Age army, you get this democratization because now more people can afford to have the armor, so the army expands. Along with that, you get this increase in right to franchise. In the early Roman armies of the Republic, soldiers are responsible for arming and equipping themselves. With the reforms of Marius and Sulla, and then later Caesar, you have soldiers who are being equipped by the state, in effect, or individual leaders who later become the state, which result in a decrease in democracy and the imposition of the empire. Is there a relationship between, a sort of a volunteer force and democratization, vice a professional force and tyranny?
Well, I'm not sure there's a clear answer to that. I think, however, there are some fundamental issues that we have ignored since Nixon went to the all-volunteer army, which is it's all very well to say that the soldiers and Marines and airmen and sailors who are all volunteers out there defending us are just like us. And they are just like the regular American people. Who's missing in that equation are the elites. The people at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and University of California at Berkeley. And they are going to be the ones who are going to be dominant in Congress, dominant in terms of who are going to be presidents, and particularly the people who serve in the cabinets. And I think, again, what we have seen in this war, Mr. Rumsfeld, of course, had served in the Navy as a Navy pilot landing on carriers, so one can't accuse him of not understanding that you can get killed in the military business even in peacetime. But I think in terms of a substantial number of the people around the President, outside of Mr. Rumsfeld on the civilian side, were fundamentally ignorant of two things. One is the nature of the military service in terms of what it requires people to do, which is, in the final analysis, lay down their lives. And even more disastrously, they were ignorant of history. And this, of course, I would put to this whole catastrophe of what has happened to history in the academy. Ohio State, I think we suffered less and are still suffering less because, in fact, a substantial portion of the department recognized that the best graduate students were coming into the military history program, and both Alan Millett and I made sure that people like Paul Herbert, where are you, Paul? Oh, you walked out. Paul Herbert actually took a course with the women's historian, where he was the only guy in a class with, I think, 12 women graduate. So we built a constituency there. But even now, in terms of the interview of one of my friends for a job there in military history, there's a substantial number of new faculty members who are saying, well, you're not doing real history. Well, for me, yeah, social history is real important. It's one of the things that we can learn a lot from. But I've been living in Washington for 10 years and not understanding how people at the highest level work and what politics really mean and what military leadership really means. And there's a difference between good military leadership and bad military leadership, and good political leadership and bad. And if we don't have people at the top who understand those issues, we're going to repeat again and again and again the mistakes we've made in Iraq. So that's my... I would, let me be perfectly frank, if we reintroduced the draft, we'd pay a huge political price for doing that in terms of squealing from the piggies on the Ivy League campuses. But the second part of it is, and again, I would be happy to see us, now this is the cost part, not just make a military draft, but if you don't want to go in the military, you can go teach in a ghetto school for 5 years. That would do as much good for the country as serving in a peacetime military. But I don't think people who want to go to and be in New York law firms want to do that. And we'd have a much less efficient and effective military. But we'd have a much more sustainable military. Because in wartime, people don't really want to sign up. They're not as enthusiastic about being a Marine. In peacetime, it's relatively easy to get a portion of the population to sign up at a very high quality. But it's a brittle military institution that we've created. It's a brilliantly effective, as we showed in this 2003 war. But it's an institution that's fragile, and many of us are afraid it's getting close to breaking in terms of the junior officers who are just simply saying, 4 tours in Iraq? Thank you. I'm out of here.
I have a question from David Martin, Phoenix Country Day School in Arizona.
Thank you. You began your paper by saying that the military and political leadership had pretty much collective amnesia over Panama and Vietnam. And I was just wondering, given what has come to light about General Petraeus and how he's often portrayed, to what extent do you also hold him accountable to that claim?
Not at all. Petraeus is very interesting. A friend of mine, at a fairly high level, went over and interviewed the division commanders in the summer of 2003 about the situation. One of the questions he asked was, do you need more troops in terms of what's clearly a fairly turbulent situation? 2 division commanders said, we need more troops. The rest said, no problemo. Those 2 were David Petraeus and Jim Mattis of the Marines. So I have nothing but huge admiration for for General Petraeus, who has consistently shown in this war. And I think his step, when he went over there to take over, to simply pull out of the Army and the Marine Corps and various other places, including the civilian world, the brightest people he could find to try and deal with this mess. If Petraeus had been in command of 2003, now again here we're dealing with counterfactual history. My sense is we would have done much better. Would we have faced an insurgency? Yes. Would we have had lots of difficulties in post-Saddam Iraq? Yes. But would we be in the kind of mess we're in now? Let me recommend, in terms of a movie that's just been out, but I'm sure it'll be available on DVD, No End in Sight. If you haven't seen it, see it. It's absolutely rigorous in the sense that it doesn't try and argue for one particular case. It just shows, it has a great number of interviews and a lot of film clips from the boys of summer of 2003, including Mr. Rumsfeld, which will. It's hard to remember how stupid they were then, but it'll bring back happy memories. So, yeah, I mean, again, the issue comes down to, I think one of the difficulties that many of us saw in the late 20th century, in the 1990s, was that the Vietnam generation was retiring from the American military. And by and large, that Vietnam generation of senior officers had a very nuanced understanding of war and conflict and if you will, the difficulty of using military instruments to achieve political goals. As the book that I'm editing called The Making of Peace, I think one of the fundamental themes of our many authors is that virtually nobody who goes into war asks the question of how are we going to end it. And that's a fundamental question, which really forces you to address issues like how do we define victory? How do we define it in not just military terms, but in political and economic terms? And very clearly, in terms of this conflict, we did nothing besides how do we get to Baghdad? Buy a lot of maps and drive on to Baghdad.
Professor Carl Walling?
Yes, I suppose one implication of what you said is that...
Speak into the microphone.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I suppose one implication of what you've just said is that when you're thinking about war and the better state of peace that you want for your side, you really need to be thinking about the costs of the peace and not simply the cost of the war before you start. The question I have addresses a revolution in war that you didn't address. You addressed many of them. It's the professionalization of militaries, beginning with the war colleges and such. What do we gain from that? And at the same time, does it come with the risk of a kind of careerism, analogous to the careerism that you were making fun of in the Ivy League, in which officers may not always be willing to speak their deepest reservations freely? You say only Petraeus and another commander, Mattis, said what they really believed about needing troops.
Well,
I wonder whether careerism's a problem.
I think the others were saying what they believed. I mean, that's the problem, is that the level of knowledge of what an insurgency looked like, and that, of course, reflected, I would argue, that the kind of professional military education, with the exception of your institution, which, the fact that there have been 2 or 3 speakers from the Naval War College here, and strategy and policy, I'm an old veteran of as well, having done 2 years in it, reflects the fact that it is an outstanding educational institution for the most part, whereas the other places are terrible. And there's a very interesting aspect of this, that the time when professional military education in the United States was really, really valued, how much valued is showed by the career of Admiral Spruance, who spent 2 tours on the faculty One tour today is enough. You are through in the United States Navy. The result of professional military education, I would argue, and I who had argued in much of the 80s about how wonderful the Germans were in terms of their educational performance, in fact, have become fundamentally disillusioned with them and much more interested as the United States military in the 20s and 30s as learning organizations. And one of the problems I think we confront with military organizations is you have to have learning organizations. The difficulty is, and there aren't many examples of that, particularly in terms of universities, which are not really learning institutions, but learning organizations are ones that change and adapt to changing circumstances out there. The great difficulty military organizations confront is that their real business only occurs sporadically, and that you have to create, if you will, in a bureaucratic framework, the capacity to learn and adapt. And again, Michael Howard, who is by far and away the greatest military historian since Thucydides, has argued that all military organizations will get the next war wrong. The issue is the good ones adapt quickly to what actually is happening. And here we're dealing with human nature, that weak military organizations and weak commanders will tend to take a picture of what future war is going to look like into the conflict and then try and make the facts fit their picture. General Westmoreland, a particularly good example of that. Great military commanders take a picture into war and then change the picture to accord with what's actually happening out there. And I think it's very clear in terms of looking at the successful brigade commanders and regimental commanders in the Marine Corps and the Army out there, that the really successful ones in Iraq thus far have been those who have been out finding out what's actually going on. The weak ones have stayed in their wonderfully electronic headquarters with all sorts of electrons and icons zipping around and consistently gotten it wrong. There is something that the Germans call about Fingerspitzengefühl, feeling at the end of your fingers. You get that in terms of dealing with other cultures and other people by interacting with them. You don't get it through electrons. Anyway, I've really gone off the track. But professional military education, I think, and I've been arguing this case for 20 years now with no discernible success, I'm happy to say. No, I'm very unhappy about it. Professional military education is, I think, crucial to the building of general officers who are intellectually capable of adapting. And General Mattis here and Petraeus are both extraordinarily good examples of this. General Petraeus has a PhD from Princeton. General Mattis doesn't have a PhD from Princeton. He owns 8,000 history books. He reads. And in fact, of course, you don't have to get a PhD to educate yourself. You can read books, which is what George Marshall did.
One final question from Sam Varsano at Parsippany Hills High School in New Jersey.
Given your views on the intellectual deficit of the civilian leaders and the subsequent performance in Iraq, I'm wondering what your take is on what our collective responsibility is towards General Shinseki, is it? Who is the one, well, you know who he is. And,
yeah. And I know what you
know what I'm getting
pushing
at.
Towards, yeah. I disagreed with a great deal of things that General Shinseki did while he was Chief of Staff of the Army, but he did what he was supposed to do in terms of, I would argue that, again, sort of one of the pictures that some of those who study civil-military relationship seem to want to impose, which is the idea that we want a military who simply says, yes, sir, 3 bags full. And I would argue the critical element, which you see in Churchill's handling of the British military in World War II, or Roosevelt's, who, oh, by the way, Churchill never overruled his military in World War II. Roosevelt overruled his military twice. Said, you will do this. You don't want to do it, you will do this. Is what I'd call a dialogue
discourses, what Machiavelli would call discourses, an argument and an exchange of ideas when you confront really difficult issues, where senior commanders, and had General Zinni been in command of Central Command, he would have told Mr. Rumsfeld, no sir, not 3 bags full, and he might well have gotten fired from it. We need senior officers like General Shinseki. Now, General Shinseki did not volunteer this information. He did the right thing in that each 3-star general and 4-star general, when they're confirmed, have to go before the Senate Armed Services, House Armed Services Committee. And there they are. The first question they're asked is, will you provide this body with your independent view of what should be done? And General Shinseki, like a whole bunch of others did, went before Congress. They said, well, what do you think about the troop totals? And he said, flat out, there aren't enough. Flat out, we need 250, 300,000. And he was right, and they were wrong. And I think in terms of somebody who was willing to morally stand up and say what he believed, which he supposedly had sworn an oath to, but not all people follow their oaths. So I have huge admiration for the man's integrity. I guess that's... Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Professor Murray, for a perfect conclusion to a very intense and powerful intellectual weekend. Before we go, I have 5 minutes of comments. I have a few administrative announcements, and then I'd like to tell you what goes on going forward from this weekend. I did write down a few notes which you probably can't read, but the problem is I can't read it either, so you'll have to bear with me. I do want to thank Paul Herbert, my partner in bringing about this conference, and his entire staff for really taking care of all the incredible things that go on behind the scenes to make a conference like this possible. I also want to thank Mike Noonan, my colleague at FPRI, who drafted, Mike, you might raise your hand, he drafted the original plan for this conference over a year ago, and then went off to Iraq for a year of service as a captain in the U.S. Army Reserve, which, however, did not prevent him from communicating with me whenever I ran into a problem, and he was giving me suggestions for building this conference, which was quite remarkable under the circumstances he was in. I'd also like to thank all of our great speakers, many of whom are still with us even at this closing session. And I would like to thank our funders. The Annenberg Foundation provides core funding for our weekend history institutes. The Bradley Foundation provides funding, and we have a new grant from the Kauffman Foundation for a project going forward called Teaching the History of Innovation. This weekend received funding from a group of our trustees, Bruce Hooper, John Templeton Jr., Keen Butcher, and Bob Friedman, and Bob is in the back, so you might raise your hand. We thank you very much for making this possible. Now, as Paul mentioned, all of you were given a form for filling out information to get college credit from Carthage College. Carthage is represented today by Art Sear, also there in the back. And Carthage is also one of our co-sponsors. For a nominal fee, they do provide college credit for this course, for this weekend of instruction. If you don't elect to take credit from Carthage, we do provide you in the mail a certificate of instruction that you can use for professional development hours. You also have in your packets an evaluation form. We ask you to fill it out either today or send it in by mail, or you'll get a copy of it by email. You could return it electronically. We don't ask you to say just nice things. We want criticism. It's the only way we can build this into an even better experience going forward. I'd also like to thank our great videographers who make it possible to post these programs on our website. And they have the ironic name Primitive World Productions. We thank them. Going forward, we are having at least 3 weekends for the next 2 years, and perhaps more, The next weekend History Institute will be in March on China Encounters the West. It will be held at a hotel in the vicinity of the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, which is our co-sponsor for that program. Later on in the year, we will have a weekend on America in the Civil War era to correspond with the forthcoming volume by Walter McDougall, his second volume in his series on U.S. history. And we were also planning for this year a program on picking up from what Martin Van Creveld touched off last night, Understanding the Nuclear Revolution. This will likely be held at the Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas. We hope to be back here, if we haven't overstayed our welcome, Paul, at some point this year, this coming year or the following on American military history. We do have already planned an agenda for 2 entire weekends devoted to all of America's wars, with each session dealing with a particular war. Paul showed you the list of wars, and we plan to go through each one of those in a coming weekend. Let's see. Finally, some of you may have noticed that a few weeks ago, on September 11th, we held a webcast on what students should know about 9/11, and that is available on our website for viewing anytime. But we're also conducting an ongoing research project on what teachers are teaching about 9/11, and so we solicit your ideas, your lessons, what you've been doing, what your schools are doing about informing our students about 9/11. I just want to leave you with one final thought before you go back into your classrooms, and that is there's a very beautiful Talmudic saying that if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved the entire world. I have my students do a math problem that, when they solve it, actually proves the literal truth of that statement. So you're going to have to take it on faith that the statement is true, literally. And if you follow its logic, if you change a single life, it is as if you have changed the entire world. And I think teachers, more than perhaps anybody else in our society, are in a position to do just that. So if we take what I will call the Walling imperative, and that is to create a rumble in your classroom, you will change the world. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again in a future weekend.